Hi, everyone, and welcome to another special episode of the Mirror Media Podcast. Today, we're actually joined by Professor Prakash Shah, an attorney and a lecturer in London, and we'll get into his background in a few minutes. And we're going to be talking today about the Western foundations of the caste system. It's a heavy topic, and I think a very potentially divisive topic, very controversial and high explosiveness topic, but it's also a topic that needs to be addressed, especially the way I think Professor Shah and his co-writers and co-editors of the book addressed it. And today we also have Racchit joining us on the interview. So without further ado, Professor Shah, would you kind of give us your background and kind of how you went from being an attorney into kind of the work you're doing now, and kind of your educational background and where you are currently.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mukunda and Racchit for your invitation. I've seen a number of your earlier podcasts, quite impressive collection of people you have there. So in terms of my own background, I'm actually not an attorney, nor am I a professor, because, I'll deal with the attorney part first. I am not qualified to practice law, although I have 3 degrees in law. And I'm not a full professor in the British academic hierarchical system. Although in the United States, I would probably be something like an associate professor, I suppose. So in the British hierarchy, I'm referred to as a reader. I'm a reader in culture and law at the University of London currently.
And what does that mean exactly?
So I guess that's a kind of professor in waiting, a full professor in waiting.
Okay.
Yes. So, would you like me to say something about my academic background?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you can, kind of like not only your academic background, but kind of your background as an individual, right? Because I think that's important to frame the conversation and how you got into where the work you're doing now too.
I think you're probably more correct than you may realize, because one of the things that I should mention is my birthplace is not in India, nor is it in Britain. So I was born in Kenya, member of the Indian diaspora, but on the African side. Wow. And I had my early education up to the end of primary level in Kenya, in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. And I immigrated to Britain when I was 13 years old, and fell into the middle of high school here in the United Kingdom. So, and I've lived here ever since. So I've been resident and national of Britain for more than 35 years or so. One of the things that I might mention it in due course, because I think it also has a bearing on how I came to approach the problem of caste, which is what the book under discussion is about.
Yeah.
Or I can mention it straight away. I mean, I just briefly, I'd like to say that, see, the way caste has been received among the members of the Indian diaspora in East Africa is not the way I think it has been it's been received among people of a similar age to myself, who've been brought up in India. So in India, caste carries a massive stigma because of the Indian educational system and the kind of stigma it transmits about caste to people who go through it. So in that sense, it's important that I have this East African background, because I haven't grown up with the same kind of stigma around caste that so many of my Indian colleagues in cohort have. And nor did I suppose, absorb the kind of stigma about caste, or such as it exists, among the people of my age who would have been brought up in Britain primarily, born and brought up in Britain, which I wasn't. So I think having had that sort of halfway education in East Africa, in a way insulated me from having this sort of stigma about caste, and also allowed me to approach it from an academic perspective I would like to suggest in a more neutral way than many Indian scholars have been able to.
Sure. So, if I may ask, so you came from Kenya around age 12 or 13, right, to the
Yeah,
UK?
that's correct.
And did you live in London? Did you live in one of the like the areas where a lot of the Indian people or the diaspora lived, or did you live like somewhere else?
I uh, I've always lived in areas of London, different areas
Hmm.
of London, where the Indian diasporic presence has been significant, fairly significant.
Okay.
So yeah,
So
or
when
you might say more broadly, the South Asian diasporic presence has been fairly significant.
so Professor Shaw, because I am an attorney, I tend to ask questions throughout just to kind of flesh out, your the story and your ideas. So if you don't mind, could I ask some questions about your?
Not at all, not at all. Feel
Oh,
free. Yeah.
okay. So when you came to the UK and you were living, say, now in the diaspora of the UK, at this time, did you find like a difference between the Indian community that you belong to in Kenya and then the Indian community that you belong to in the UK? Was there a difference of culture and how you even thought about caste when you came to the UK, or did that not play a role at all?
Well, the to answer the first part of your question, uh, the Indian community, or the part of it which I joined when I arrived in Britain, was basically an extension of the East African community that I had been a part of while
Oh,
living in Kenya. So, as you might appreciate, in Britain, the way in which migration patterns have developed has been very much in terms of the extension of transnational and translocal networks
mhm.
particularly among the Indian diaspora and more broadly the South Asian diaspora. So people tend to link up with people who they already know, have a familial connection with, or some kind of acquaintance, for a
Right.
relationship or friendship, or some other such a link. That's what happened to us actually. So relatives of ours were already in Britain,
Right.
and fairly well represented in the area of Britain that we ended up in. And so I suppose you could say, in that sense, it was a sort of soft landing.
Right.
But then you very quickly become aware that there are people from all kinds of different areas of origin who are now represented in Britain. And so that became a sort of growing consciousness, if you like. And
Right.
in a sense, I managed to deepen that consciousness also by pursuing the kind of academic studies that I did eventually.
Sure.
So so where you where you're then met with the existing research on the communities, the kind of data that exists on the communities, and so on. So a lot of my work in subsequent to school days in university has
Mhm.
been around immigration law, the establishment of diaspora communities, um, the multiculturalism in Britain, how the state has responded to the identity demands of different groups and communities, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So I've been following and tracking the way in which different diasporas have developed and established themselves in Britain and in the wider Europe more recently, and the ways in which legal accommodation has been patterned for different diaspora groups in that way.
Sure.
So yeah,
So, if you don't mind me asking, I assume, given your name, you're from the Gujarati community, right?
very well, very well guessed.
Yeah. So and the thing I'm hesitant about, and I don't know how Rachit feels about this, and I'm just kind of going with it, is so we're about to get into not only your background but also the very heated, debated, controversial, personal, and difficult issue of caste.
Sure.
So in this context, do you think, or have you ever dealt with your caste uh, by writing this book, having a sense of people telling you that whether or not you belong to a higher caste, and therefore you come from a place of privilege to even talk about this. And that's one of the things I want to see. I mean, like, for example, like I come from the Iyengar community in Tamil Nadu, which is, we're a Brahmana Varna, and then and Jati would be, I guess, Iyengar. I don't know. But there's always these issues that for me to even talk about caste, there's this idea that because I belong to a community that was historically seen as being superior, that anything I say is probably invalid or not of worth listening to. Now, my question to you is, did you ever deal with that in your process of in your past few years of education, and probably even when you started this project?
The short answer is no. I didn't really encounter it for many years, and it's only recently, I suppose, since the whole issue of caste became a kind of came onto the legal radar and the parliamentary radar, that I began to take a greater interest in it, and actually became aware that it was something around which a politics could be done, and a legal regime could be framed, right?
Right.
I mean, one was always aware, somewhat in the background, that Indians have caste. The kind of stories, the narrative that we're all familiar with. That Indians have caste, they have a caste system, and so on. But it was never really in your face. Growing up in Britain, and even during my university days and so on, I never really encountered any kind of stigma. I mean, people sometimes, people might say to you, oh, you're from an Indian background, you have caste, don't you, or you have a caste system, but that's as far as it goes. So people at large have this kind of broad common sense that there is something, there's some relationship between Indian culture and caste, but that's what they know about it. They don't know much more about it.
Right.
And then when I more recently, when I've begun to look at the academic writing around caste in Britain specifically, I realized that there's actually been very little research on caste in Britain, which is actually quite interesting, because it's a bit of a contrast to how things have developed in India for several decades now, and also the way in which caste has come to be politicized in the American scene, in the American academic scene. So that's a kind of, I suppose it's an interesting factoid, one which I came to be aware of, but in my more recent research, not as I've been growing up.
Sure. So after you came to the UK, and we'll get back to these subjects, I just want to broach it really quickly and then pick up on it later on as we get into the meat of the argument of the book. So you came to the UK 12, 13. Where did you end up going to, I guess, undergraduate and your other degrees? Where did you end up doing those?
Sure. So I all my degrees have been in law. So my first two degrees were at the London School of Economics, which is part of the University of London.
Yeah.
And for my doctorate, I was at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is also part of the same university.
Okay.
So pretty much a London-centric kind of higher education experience.
And were you really focused on, you said earlier, immigration work, or was there something else that you kind of focused your academic pursuit on?
No, that's absolutely right. My first academic specialization, if you can call it that, was in immigration law, migration law, nationality issues, refugee law. In fact, my doctorate was in refugee law, how refugee law developed over a period of several centuries in the British context, and how it took legal form in relation to different population movements across time.
I think that's, I mean, I think it's going to be such a, I would love to talk about that too, because I think that's so interesting, especially
yes.
in the modern context of what's going on in the Arab world and the migration issues, both dealing in the U.S. side on the illegal immigration that they, from Central and South America and Mexico, and then on the European side from the Arab nations that are in turmoil coming into the country. We could talk about it later, but I think it's fascinating. And I guess my question to you is, why did you decide not to practice law when you're so passionate about it, as far as going up to getting a PhD?
Well, there's an interesting background to that. My father actually studied in law in London as an overseas student from Kenya back in the 1950s. So he qualified as a barrister. Then came back to Kenya to start his practice. And so I'd always grown up with this idea that law is a noble profession, and had more or less considered no other career in, as I was growing up. And obviously one looks up to one's father, and I always had, thought of him as quite a heroic figure, because he always seemed to stand for the disenfranchised,
Right.
the kind of the David rather than the Goliath in the legal battles that he fought.
Sure.
So I, in a way, I'd always had this implicit idea that I would probably pursue him into the legal profession and so on.
Right.
When the decision had to be made, though, towards the end of my undergraduate studies, because in Britain we have separate bar exams. You've got to kind of spend some time studying at the bar and so on, and then do your training, do your pupillage. But when it came to applying for the bar, I had to sign this form, and somebody has three. I think some can't remember the number of persons who have to certify that you're a jolly good fellow, or I mean, I'm putting it in a facetious way, but it was almost as bad as that.
Right.
And I thought, oh, can I face this? I'm not really sure if I'm ready to enter a kind of profession which is premised around these kinds of, structures, if you like, or conventions. Right. And so I just sort of did it around, did a master's degree, did a PhD. And the only reason I did a PhD actually was because I got a grant from the School of Oriental and African Studies to do one. So, it was a series of fortuitous happenings that led me into the academic path rather than, it sort of, in a way, confirmed for me that the legal practice world wasn't for me, but that academia could be a viable option instead.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's really interesting. So just a quick aside, Racchit's just dropped off. He'll jump back on in about like 15, 20 minutes. He has a work call that you got to take, but he'll jump right back on. So I think it's fast. So you.
Hello.
Practice.
Sorry, you dropped off for a bit there.
Okay. No, yeah. I was sorry. I said, you can you hear me properly now?
Yes.
Okay. So you decide not to practice law and then stay in the academic world. And this is going to curtail into your book. But how did you get in touch with Professor S.N. Balagangadhara? Because your book is such a big testament to his work. How did you end up interacting with him, and how did you get the book process started with him involved?
Well, Professor Balagangadhara, or Balu as he's known for short, is probably I became aware of his work probably around a decade ago. So it's pretty recent, if you like, in my academic career. Right. And so it was certainly, I hadn't heard of him. I wasn't aware of his work in the years that I was sort of forming, if you like, as an academic,
right,
and pursuing intellectual problems and so on. So, in fact, very recently, I've written this up somewhere in draft. I tried to describe my academic trajectory. Uh-huh. So I suppose my first academic trajectory or influence in the academic world was through a professor of South Asian law at SOAS.
Okay.
Werner Menski, who is and was and continues to be one of the foremost experts on Hindu law in Britain and in Europe, in the wider Europe, in fact.
By Hindu law, do you mean like Dhyabhaga and Mitakshara law?
Yeah, the entire Dharmashastrik.
Dharmashastra.
Yeah. And pre-Dharmashastra, post-Dharmashastra.
Very much connected to like Patrick Olivelle.
Yeah, you could say.
Yeah.
and also Hindu law into the colonial period and post-colonial period and so on.
Wow.
So yeah,
Interesting.
I never studied that material formally with him, but I used to read more or less everything he wrote. So I tended to, and he's also a comparative lawyer. So I sort of developed a parallel interest in comparative law while not having studied comparative law with him or under him. But if you like, studied by osmosis all the
Right.
stuff that he was producing and the kind of influences that he was exposing me to. But the first thing that if you like, I tried to follow him into in a more concrete way was the diversification of my own interest from immigration law into this question of cultural diversity, or as we used to call it, ethnic minorities and law in Britain. Yeah, because he was one of the first people to have set up a specific bespoke course at SOAS on ethnic minorities and law.
I see.
So before that, the subject was virtually unknown at university level.
Interesting.
And so I ended up teaching that. And then it so happened that most of my research actually, ended up being on questions of cultural diversity and law.
It's just really fascinating, the fact that Britain was, the empire which the sun did not set. So there must have been so much ethnic diversity and minorities for at least a couple hundred years on Britain's soil. So, I mean, the fact that the study didn't even become anything until recently is kind of strange to me.
Well, I suppose, you see, even before Professor Mensky's course was started, you already had, the study of the race question, if you like, particularly from the 50s and 60s in Britain, and lots of sociologists and other types of social scientists, anthropologists had done work on diaspora groups, micro studies, and so on. So it wasn't as though academia in general was unaware of the increasing diversification of British society, particularly in the post-war period. But I suppose my remarks are more relevant to the legal domain. See, in the legal domain, it took somebody like Professor Mensky to really pioneer a legal course or a legal curriculum for the study of ethnic minorities and law, and that didn't happen until the late 1980s. So compared to other academic domains, I suppose law was a kind of latecomer.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And I think if you look at developments in the United States, Canada, and so on, you'll see similar parallel sorts of development where the lawyers have kind of more lately become interested in stuff that, in material that other groups of social scientists were already working on.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, I'm sorry to throw the trajectory. I mean, the divergence, but continue, please, with how you connected with Professor Minsky and then to Balagangadhara eventually.
Oh yeah. So I, as I was saying, I mean, I got exposed to all kinds of different influences because of my acquaintance with Professor Mensky, and he was also my doctoral supervisor.
Right.
Which meant that I could, I could work quite closely with him on a number of things, a number of sort of projects and questions, which all had some overall link, at some higher level.
Right.
So I suppose the one thing that became a link to Professor Balagangadhara was my interest, which Professor Mensky had inspired in questions of Hindu law and South Asian law.
Sure.
And so when I came across Professor Balagangadhara's work, some of the kind of I suppose I don't know if milestone is the right word, but some of the signposts were there, if you like, which helped make me alert enough to recognize that here was somebody who was a very important intellectual who had pioneered his own research program and was asking questions about the study of India and the comparison of Europe and India as cultures in their own right, in a very, very different way to how the dominant scholarship was working on those questions. Right. So, it immediately attracted me to his work. And then, I began to meet students of his who'd done work within his research program and so on. And I thought, I was absolutely amazed. I thought, wow, this is a really different way of looking at Indian traditions and culture. And also a different way of looking at how Europe has fundamentally influenced the way in which we look at Asian culture as a whole, actually, and not
Right.
just Asian culture, of course, as we know. The way Europe's thought about the whole world
Right.
is the way we actually predominantly think about that world.
Wherever you're from.
So
Right. That's right.
yeah, and our place in it and so on, and that includes India, but it's not restricted to India or to Asia. You know. So he really sort of brought home some of the very deep problems that were attending research and the study of India, and for me that extends to the study of the Indian diaspora as well.
Right.
And it was really, in a way, you could say it was another fortuitous set of circumstances, because had I not been acquainted with Professor Balu's work for a few years already, I wouldn't have been able to intervene in the question of the law on caste discrimination in Britain, which just sort of popped up just a few years down the line from 2013 onwards. Right. So the sequence of events was really amazing. That I was in a position to be able to look at the problem of the caste law in Britain in a way that no other academic was prepared to do in Britain.
So let's actually talk about that, because I think that's what your chapter in the book is about. Because I think it's actually a good segue into the sequence of events that led you to start the book. I think it's also connected to the chapter in the book you wrote, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so can you kind of walk us through that sequence, and then we could talk about the details of your chapter, and then kind of get an overview of the rest of the book.
Yes. You mean how I came to encounter the question of the caste law in Britain? Yeah.
Yeah, and then how that led to the book. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So actually, I was a kind of latecomer to the question of the caste law, because, see, already in around 2009, 2010, the question was already there. And in fact, the legislators had already inserted the word caste into the anti-discrimination law in Britain, right? But at that time, they'd given themselves power to legislate, right? So the expression of caste was in the law, but it hadn't been implemented, right, to make caste discrimination unlawful. But in 2013, what happened was that some members of the House of Lords, which represent certain vested interests, of which I've been fairly critical subsequently, they ensured that reference to caste in the existing equality law was strengthened in such a way as to compel the government to implement caste for the purposes of the equality law, right? Which would have made caste one of the grounds for bringing legal actions under that discrimination law, right? So you could have been sued for caste discrimination.
Yeah, but that was in effect from 2010, right?
Yes, as I'm trying to say, there was a kind of layering, right? So the 2010 version of the law was a kind of permissive expression, in the sense that it would have allowed the government to implement that law.
I see. It would give them the choice.
Exactly. And so, as we say in English law, the government had the power to implement, to make caste an aspect of race. But in 2013, that wording changed from may to must. Right? So they were obliged from thereon to make caste an aspect of race. And that's an interesting story, how caste got to be made an aspect of race. So the racial element is very important.
Yes, we'll jump into that, but I want to get into what, if you would know, why was there even the idea of having caste even in the 2010 anti-discrimination law? I mean, is there a history of caste issues or violence or any discrimination in the UK that would kind of be the basis for why they would do that?
Well, let's say some people have said that there is an issue of caste discrimination in Britain. Let's get that out of the way.
Okay.
Right. But if you look at the kind of report stroke studies that came out before 2010 on the question, basically they've been produced by these let's say as a group, collectively you could call them the Dalit organizations. Right. So there are a variety of differently constituted Dalit organizations. Most of them seem to have some kind of link with one branch or the other of the Christian churches. And so, in a sense, the way I've tended to view it is that they're a proxy for Christian church interests of different types. Right? And so they're the ones who began to produce these reports from around the year, let's say, the middle of the 2000s, the middle of that decade. And what's really interesting is that pattern of producing reports coincides with discussions in the United Nations on caste discrimination. Now, those discussions were primarily targeted at India and secondarily Nepal. But gradually what happened, and again, this is around the middle of the same decade, the UN officials began to point to the Indian diaspora, particularly in the United Kingdom and United States, but also other places like Mauritius, as having some kind of caste discrimination problem. And what's interesting is that they start to reference these reports which are being produced by Dalit organizations. Right? So now, my argument has been that the reports or the so-called studies which these Dalit organizations have produced, they're not worth anything in terms of their research validity. And they're pretty self-serving. So they'll take a series of anecdotes and present them as though there is some conclusive, evidence of caste discrimination patterns, etc., etc. So I've tended to be fairly critical of them, and that goes for subsequent studies as well, which have tried to justify the legislation and so on. Even at an official level, there's been studies. So so that's the kind of long and short of it. So you get a coincidental presence of activist organizations in Britain at the NGO level. And you get the supranational bodies at the UN human rights level, which seem to be coordinated. And I'm pretty certain that they are, because actually what you'd see is that the NGOs at a macro level, they have some macro organizations which are also intervening on the same issues at UN level. So and in fact, what's interesting is that some broader studies have shown how Christian transnational organizations, these kind of lobby organizations, have been very, very proficient at being able to influence the UN organs for various policy initiatives in order then to drive different or individual nation states into, complying with the demands of the UN human rights bodies and even beyond the human rights bodies, in fact. So I think caste is actually just one instance of a much larger pattern, if you want to look at it like that,
Right, and if I may, I'm gonna throw a couple questions here. One way to look at this, right, it'd be the intent of these organizations. It can either be because they actually find some sort of injustice occurring and they want to correct it, or secondarily, it can be something of, and I think the book and Balagangadhara touches upon this in The Heathen and His Blindness, and there's other books in his works. The idea that over time, the Western world has conceived of Hinduism and caste being almost synonymous. So the way to attack, especially for proselytization, to attack Hinduism is to attack caste. And you defeat caste and you can convert more people to wherever you want to do. So, I think those would be the two major kind of potential reasons for doing this. I don't know if there's a third or a fourth, but I think those seem to be kind of what's kind of prevailing in my mind. And based on how you're presenting it, I would gather that maybe it's a mix of both those reasons. Maybe there are some injustices they want to correct, but also for the larger goal of spreading the gospel and conversion.
I think you've joined the dots very well there, if I may say so. So there are two, you pointed out, let's say, at least two main factors there, right? The one major factor which lurks in the background is how we think of Indian culture. And Indian culture is, if you like, more or less coterminous with Hinduism.
Right.
As the dominant, if you like, influencer of that culture, as we've, that's the narrative that we've received.
Right.
Hinduism as a caste system, and of course, that story about Hinduism and the caste system has been entirely created by mainly the British, but with a strong European hand in it, European Christian hand in it. So, broadly, you can say caste is a construction of Orientalism,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, and of course, we see in our research program, by which I mean Balu's research program, under whose influence we tend to work. The question of construction has to be spelled out very clearly.
Right.
Right. What do we mean by construction? By construction, we don't mean necessarily that something which the Orientalists have talked about, and by Orientalists, there's a whole collection of people there, right? But from missionaries, colonial civil servants, travelers, merchants, etc. So there's a whole group set of contributors to what collectively we know as Orientalism today. But what's interesting is that at some point, let's say around the beginning of the 19th century, they began to concretize some idea that the dominant religion in India is Hinduism, and Hinduism has a caste system, right? So there was a kind of convergence of the huge mass of information that Orientalism produced. And this view of India seemed to concretize around that point, right? Now, it doesn't mean to say that they were thinking exactly about caste and caste system the way, if you like, scholars or social scientists would predominantly consider today. It's not exactly the same thing. But certainly, if you like, the formation of some kind of prototypical image of caste had already taken place around the turn of the 18th and 19th century.
Sure.
Now, that subsequently seeps into secular theorizing about India and its culture and society, to the extent that today what you have is the social sciences taking up those themes which were initially laid out and putting further flesh to them. So our broader argument is that contemporary social sciences contain within them are basically Orientalist and an Orientalist construction which has no bearing on the reality of Indian culture and society. So by construction, what we mean is that, yes, these people have developed an idea, but that idea is based on their experience of Indian culture and society, right? So ideas like Hinduism and the caste system are experiential entities, as Balu says, right? They are experiential entities which enable Westerners to go about in India and with Indians, right? So that is their way of making sense about what they encounter with India or in India.
Right.
It doesn't represent the social reality or the cultural reality of India. Because what they've done in creating this experiential entity is bring together things that actually don't belong together within the Indian culture or society, right? So they've artificially, if you like, in so constructing these ideas, made links between different aspects of things that they have seen, and of course those things are there. Many of them are there, and they put them together and theorize and develop theories about them as if they are real, right? But our argument has been that actually they have no corresponding reality in Indian culture and society. And that goes as much for the caste system as it does for Hinduism, right? So actually there is a broader problematization of both experiential entities in Balu's research program.
Which I think is fascinating because, I mean, right now I'm just thinking in my head, right? I spend quite a bit of time reading through psychological studies and research and taking part in, I don't know if you know who Jonathan Haidt is.
Yes, I've just been reading one of his books,
the
Coddling
of the American Mind.
Yes.
So he has this, he puts a bunch of this data together, but I think he has this site, or someone else does, where you can go and test your biases, right? Where you go in and they'll show you They use words like positive words, negative words, pictures of black people and white people, and then they do a mixed match to gauge your level of, I would say, your bias, right?
Yes.
And what I'm seeing is this almost correlation. I mean, this not correlation, but a connection in how what you just described, right? As there's this conception of what people, let me put it in the American sense of race. There's this conception of what people think black people are or white people are.
Yes.
And then there's the reality of what they are.
Yes.
And the conception and the reality get so mixed up and mingled up that it, like, ideas of goodness or laziness or this or that is connected, even though they're abstract concepts, are connected to ideas of race. And in a similar way, I think what you're, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, is what you're saying is the Western concepts of however the West came to look at India and the reality of what India or Hindus were got so mixed up and interconnected that it created this sense of, oh, we have this concept of caste in our head, therefore the reality must be there has to be a caste, as opposed to saying this is just our concepts of what is a system, and this is how it is in India that may or may not play into our concepts.
Yes, absolutely. So it becomes a kind of presupposition of all subsequent theorizing about India.
Right.
Right. And so that's the kind of role that these experiential entities have played. And you could say probably similar things for, issues like the Aryan invasion theory and all kinds of other things, right? But what's important to underline here is that the connection between caste and Hinduism is not coincidental, because what happens is that we have to bring in the figure of religion and the religion of Christianity, and the way in which that becomes the kind of framework for making intelligible things that were encountered in outside of Europe. So in this case, India, we are talking about, right?
Right.
So, and the Protestant background of, particularly of the British, helped to concretize the idea of Hinduism, first of all, as a false religion, and as a religion of priesthood, which was dominated by the priesthood, which, the Brahmins. And so they were supposed to, if you like, be purveying false doctrines as though they were true doctrines. Now, that's a very important issue, because what that does is underscore the fundamental immorality of Indian culture.
Right.
Right. So the kind of it's not as though Indians don't have moral norms. It's just that the norms that Indians have are purveyed as though they're moral, but actually fundamentally they're immoral because they are part of a false religion. Right. Now.
Right.
So
I think this is what Professor Gangadhar says in his chapter, which is the Brahmins force people to believe that their morality is a true morality, but in fact they're forcing them to act in immoral ways.
Yeah, actually, in our book, it's Jacob de Roover who takes up that theme very strongly.
Okay,
in fact he shows that there is a you see, the way in which priesthood and priestcraft and the false religion of the Indians is viewed, particularly by the Protestant missionaries, but not just the missionaries, right? All kinds of different writers with a Protestant background who talked about India in the 18th and 19th centuries are drawing on the Protestant polemic against, firstly, Catholicism, and secondly, Judaism.
Right.
And it's that polemic which helps them to frame their idea of India and India's priestcraft in Hinduism, as exemplified by Hinduism.
Absolutely. And this is, and so I want to do a couple things. First, we'll take it back to the point where you're talking about the 2013 change in the caste in the British sense. So you can talk about your article, because I think now we see the connections that you've built into why and how kind of the book, the underlying underpinnings of the book. And then I just want to point out, like, a note, this is similar to what Joydeep and Vishwa Adiluri are doing when it comes to scholarship of Indology. They use very similar ideas, I think, of Balagangadhar, in the sense of the entire way that even the texts of Hinduism were approached was with this sense of Christian viewpoint of first versus Catholicism, and then Judaism, and then somehow like the Brahmins fit into the priests of either Catholicism or Judaism. That's why they're controlling evil, and not just I don't know if you read their work. It's very similar, but they take it from not in the perspective of sociology and current studies on caste, but more about like how the West approached the texts of India.
Yes, yes. I can't say that I'm very familiar with their work, but I'm somewhat familiar, and I've seen some interviews by the team and so on.
Sure.
But I think there are very, very interesting meeting points between their work and Balu's research program.
Absolutely.
So I think there's room for some cross fertilization there that still I'm still waiting for to happen.
Right.
And eagerly awaiting some very interesting dialogues on that.
I'm sure it's going to happen.
Very
soon, hopefully. But yeah, if we could take it back for a second to the 2013 reinforcement from the May or to shall.
Yes, sure.
Or
but
must.
do you mind? Actually, I think I didn't. If you don't mind, I'll just rewind a little bit because I didn't complete. Because earlier we talked about two factors. So the first factor is this broader background of Orientalism and how it comes to influence contemporary social sciences. Right?
Yes.
And how caste and not just caste, but an immoral caste system becomes a presupposition for the study of Indian culture and society, and that has been. Of course, transplanted to the study of the Indian diaspora as well, more recently. So that's the first aspect. Now, so of course, Christianity has a fundamental framing role to play there, right?
Yeah.
In all kinds of ways, to the extent that ideas about caste in Hinduism become common sense notions about India. Right, and its diaspora. They're so common sense that they actually don't need discussion. They're taken for granted assumptions. And I suppose when you get the average legislator in Britain, somebody in the House of Lords or House of Commons, or the average lawyer who's going to be litigating cases on caste, they too would probably have this a very superficial notion of what India is about, what Indian culture and society are about. But they would be certain that there is a caste system and it's immoral, right? So that presupposition now becomes part of the general common sense assumptions, a kind of folk wisdom in the Western culture about India, right? And so that's very important to underline, and the role that Christianity plays in that. So that's in terms of how Christianity structures a way of thinking about another culture. Now, the second factor is also, and this is the more contemporary issue which you also drew attention to already, which is why would caste be introduced into a law in the United Kingdom in 2010, 2013? Why would that happen? Now, and what's the connection to the international level, and what's the connection to India in particular, right? And so this is where we have some hypotheses which I think could be defended. And so I'll spell them out. I'll try to spell them out for you. So Britain, we think, is not a direct addressee of the problematization and activism around caste and the caste system. Actually, the more direct addressee is India. But so Britain comes to play a kind of proxy role in the larger fight with India about caste system, and the place of Christians in the caste reservations, proselytization, conversion, all of those intertwined debates, which are very live in India, get played out in a very oblique way in the British context and during the British caste debate, if that makes sense. It may not make sense, but I'm happy to elaborate on any element of that. But that's the second governing factor, if you like, which you already hinted at, but I just wanted to underline.
Sure, and I totally understand your position, and I think it makes sense. Racchit, who hasn't had, I've been very too much talking too much. Racchit, I'm sure you've had some comments, questions that you want to ask Professor Shah.
Absolutely, a lot of questions and comments, but luckily, Professor Shah, I think you touched upon some of them, particularly the whole idea that this whole Christian framework of analysis of religion was applied to the religions and cultures of India, and how everything was was essentially standardized, and also the fact that this historical critique of Catholicism and the Jewish tradition was then kind of taken wholesale and applied to the analysis of India. So I'm happy you brought that up. It's also very interesting to me, and I'd like you to talk a little more about this, that Britain seems to have played a central role in the creation of this modern concept of caste, and also its propagation into modern times with this Equality Act being passed in 2013. And I find it very interesting, I can hark back to a video I saw of some parliamentarian talking about the inequities of caste and how, this is so wrong in India. When I look at British society itself, I mean, it seems like a very caste-based society to me, because in essence what I see when I look at it is a German monarchy, a Norman aristocracy, an Anglo-Saxon sort of middle class, and a Celtic underclass. I don't know if anyone's taught or talked about British society in this way, but I'd like
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
So I think yes, Racchit. That's people have tried to make a similar point. I mean, certainly it's most immediate when you hear some of the Hindu spokespersons in Britain defending or trying to stave off, if you like, the prospect of the law on caste discrimination in Britain. They've tended to say, well, Britain should rather more worry about its own class system than worry about, an insignificant and certainly not non-proven alleged problem of caste discrimination. So yeah, that's been pointed out certainly.
Right.
Yeah. Well, but to be honest, I mean, I can see its sort of rhetorical value, but I'm not sure if you'd want to take it any further than that, because you'd start to encounter some problems. So one of the problems that you'd encounter is, you see, when we talk about class, we don't think about it as fundamentally immoral. I mean, some people might, Marxists might do, or people of leftist orientation. They might say, well, class is a fundamentally immoral institution. But broadly speaking, in the Western culture, we don't think about it like that, right? So it's not as though, we would say Western culture, or certainly British culture, has a class system, and that means that British people are fundamentally immoral. We wouldn't think like that. But for India, we think that, right? And so that's why it's very important to get this connection between Christianity and the construction of the caste system. Because without that, and Protestantism in particular, without that link or that structural link, we wouldn't get the presupposition that Indian social structure, as the West has seen it, is fundamentally immoral. Right? Why is it immoral? Because it instructs people to act immorally. It's based on a set of commands which instruct Indians to act immorally. And so that fundamentally, we have to make that fundamental distinction between the way in which we think about the caste system and the way we think about the class system in a country like Britain. And I, of course, I've made myself blue in the face trying to discuss this issue with my Hindu interlocutors in Britain, but it doesn't get beyond a certain, because you see, at the end of the day, there's also the problem of research. Like, how do you research this? For most Indians, even in the diaspora, if you suggest to them that there is such a thing as caste system, they wouldn't say this is simply a matter of imagination, right? Or simply a matter of construction by Protestant British people sometime in the past, which has just acquired a kind of common sense in the Western culture. They wouldn't be able to say that. The only reason I'm able to say that is because of the kind of background work that's happened within the research program of Balu, right? So that's why I was saying earlier that it's so important for me to have been acquainted with that, the results of that research program, to be able to mount a fundamental critique of the way in which we are talking about caste today.
Great. No, thank you for that. That definitely helps clarify it. You know, the reason I brought that sort of criticism up is because I generally put a different flavor to it. I try to point to the fact that there is sort of ethno-racial undertones to the various divisions of British society, and I found that they've tried to extend that this whole Aryan invasion theory to India and try to justify that the different groups belong to different sort of racial origins. So that angle I haven't seen before, and the reason I bring that up again isn't to indulge in sort of a tu quoque argument or whataboutism. It was just sort of more to point out that such systems exist elsewhere, and how is the Jati and Varna system in India, and I think you talk about this in your book somewhere, different from other birth-based systems of social division elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, see, this in a way, you're touching on something very interesting, which is, was there a template which the Europeans would have used when they were looking at India? One suggestion comes from, in the present case, from Jacob de Roover's chapter, right, where he talks about the construction of Hinduism and the associated immorality of the caste system and so on, right, by reference to the polemic with the Catholics and the Jews. So in a way, that supplies one segment of the template or one part of the template. But your question suggests that maybe there was another template, which is actually the systems of classification, right? Which may or may not have had a social reality, right? But if we look at, for example, the pre-Reformation social order as the Catholics would have had us understand society was divided into, right? So probably they would have talked about a number of orders, maybe 4 or 5 basic orders within society. Is that something that goes into how Europeans subsequently end up looking at India?
Absolutely.
Right? So what was the template that was used which allowed and helped the Europeans to start classifying India, and also thinking that their classification actually has some intuitive appeal? Now, where does that intuitive appeal come from? Surely the background must be in their own culture. And what are they drawing on, right? So there are all kinds of questions like this, which I'm afraid, I mean, certainly I'm not in a position to answer, but I'm not really sure if we've done the required research to be able to answer. But I think as a heuristic, it's a very, very interesting suggestion.
Right. And so, the reason I raised this is because I felt that this research hasn't been done, and it's sort of telling to hear from you too that maybe the groundwork hasn't been done. It'd be very interesting to ask these kind of questions and sort of turn the sociological lens, back in Britain.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Racchit, you got anything else to follow up?
No, not in relation to what we've been talking about so far. Thank you.
Okay. So, Professor Shah, 2013, the law changed to force Britain or the government to prosecute caste as one of the discriminatory categories. What happened from that?
Okay, so, if I can just introduce 1 or 2 points of clarification. The Equality Act that we have in Britain is a civil law, so it's in fact its modeling is based on the Civil Rights Act in
like employment
in the United States. Exactly. Right? Well, I suppose Civil Rights Act is more concerned with employment type situations, but in Britain we also have the anti-discrimination law applied to, let's say, the provision of goods and services, membership of professions, etc., etc. I think it's somewhat wider. It also applies to educational institutions, and under more recent reforms. Is it?
Yeah, like Title IX. Yeah, Title IX.
Oh, yes. Okay, right.
Yeah, so we have so many different
parts of. Yeah. So anyway, these laws have tended to sort of develop, right, over a period of time. But so where we are today is that it's still the equality legislation or the anti-discrimination legislation is still premised on civil law understanding. So it's basically allows you to bring civil actions in damages and other related remedies. It's not criminal legislation. However, our argument is that as things have developed subsequently, the problem of criminalizing caste has seeped into the law, right? And it's happened in a very surreptitious way. But I think for that we have to go to something like 2018,
Okay.
right? So, but we're only in 2013 right now. So, okay, so in 2013, what happens is that the state is obliged to implement caste as an aspect of race for the purpose of the equality law, right? So, if that happens, which actually it hasn't happened yet, the individuals would be entitled to bring actions in under the discrimination law for caste discrimination as well,
Sure.
right? And claim damages, etc. Now, that was the intent of the law, but it hasn't panned out like that. Now, all kinds of political configurations have changed since 2013, right? Now, we used to have a coalition government between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. That's changed to a majority conservative government. Then there's a kind of, the Conservative government as the largest party, but without an overall majority. So you've got a very complicated political configuration right now. And not to mention Brexit and all of that sort of stuff.
Right.
But because of those changing circumstances since 2013, what's happened is that, first of all, the government has been able to be firmer in its view that it doesn't want to see this legislation, right? This current government has said that it doesn't want to see this legislation. And it claims that it was cornered into agreeing to an obligation to implement the caste for the purpose of the Equality Act because of political pressure from other parts of the political configuration. So today's government seems to say that we don't want this legislation. Now, in the meantime, something else has happened. There was a test case which I think was engineered in 2014, 2015. Now, that case went through the courts, and the argument in that case was, despite the non-implementation of caste as an aspect of race, can we still say that via the notion of ethnic group membership in the Equality Act, which already exists in the Equality Act, it's already expressed and is part of the law, can we say that caste is already included, right? Or to put it in a different way, does ethnicity, which already extends to descent, does it also extend to caste? And the decision from the courts was that yes, it does, right? And that was a decision around 2014, 2015. It went through the courts up and down for a while, for somewhat longer than a year. So that's why I'm saying 2014, 2015. So by that time, by 2015, it was established that actually, even without implementing the existing obligation, what you have is the provision on race extends to caste. That was an agreement. The courts basically agreed to that view, right? To that contention. So now the government actually, we think, also silently colluded in this development, because what it does is it allows them to not implement the legislative obligation, but allow the case law to basically continue on the books as a precedent, which allows those people who've been arguing for a caste discrimination law to be enacted in Britain to be basically told that, look, there is already a caste discrimination law. We don't need to implement the legislation. The case law is moved on. So that's where we are at the moment. And in fact, in 2018, the government announced the results of its own consultation on the caste discrimination law, and said that, well, actually what we decided after the consultation is that we'll let the case law exist on the case books, and we won't implement the legislation. And as far as the still existing legislative duty is concerned, we're going to pass new legislation to delete that, right? So all you'll have in the future is the case law. And if people want to bring actions on the basis of caste discrimination, they've got ample case law. They can do it through the courts already, right? So we don't need this law. So that's where we are at the moment, more or less.
So what they've done is basically equated caste to race, and if I'm correct in this, it's partially due to, and this goes back to what you earlier said with Racchit, is that because of the various ways it conceived of Aryan invasion potentially, it's like these communities of caste that exist today are somehow racially determined by the structure of the Indian system already.
Yes, in some way, yeah. It's actually not very clear, even what the judges think. So when you look at the detail of the judgment, one of the things that the judges admit is that nobody knows how to define caste. There is no agreed to sociological definition of caste, right? So everybody's kind of playing this game of emperor without clothes, right? That everybody sort of agrees politically and legally that we need a caste, law against caste discrimination, and we should have one, and the current law is adequate to provide that because we have established case law. But once you go deeper, you realize that these guys don't even know how to define caste, because you can't define caste, right?
Right.
The caste is inherently problematic as a conception, right? So once you start to apply it to the reality of Indian society, whether it's in the diaspora or in India itself, the whole thing breaks down. And that's exactly what the census takers found, right? In the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a report after report of British colonial officials saying that, look, we're trying to fit our conception of caste onto these people, but it actually doesn't fit. And the way in which we've allocated different groups to different people is actually completely internally inconsistent, right? So they went ahead with the exercise, thinking that we have some kind of, at least some coherent scholastic notion of caste.
Right.
But when you try to apply it to the ground, it completely breaks down, right?
Yeah, I think, was it your introduction, or was it Balagangadhara's that talks about this particularly, about the notion that you couldn't determine it by birth, you couldn't determine it by endogamy, you couldn't determine it by occupation.
Yes.
And so any criteria that they put to it was not able to figure out what a particular caste, what community was. Was it based on this? Was it based on that? You couldn't figure it out. Now, I guess my question to you would then be and this is kind of both a very honest question, but I also want to push it a little, is, are there any other sociological studies done, I mean, maybe you know or don't know, in other groups or in other cultures in which such idea of caste is there and is actually definable?
It's a very hard question to answer, because, you see, I'm not sure if the answer to the question would have to accept that the conceptualization of caste in relation to India is both a coherent and a defensible one. Because if that's our primary reference point for understanding what a caste system is, then we would have to accept that actually we don't know what caste system is, right? Because I mean, you imagine we've just referenced all the problems that census takers of the 19th, 20th centuries, and even the census takers of the contemporary census in India, right? They all have problems in applying their conception of caste to the ground reality in India, and the same is true of the British lawmakers here, including the judges, right? Actually, and they've admitted as much. Even academics who have supported the provision on caste discrimination in Britain have admitted that they don't know how. In fact, the judge actually quotes one of those academics, right? When she says that actually there is no agreed sociological definition or anthropological definition of caste. So
the question is then how can you, if you can't, there's no definition of it, then what are we even talking about?
Yeah, that we have no coherent conceptualization of it. And so I suppose one option is you do what some of the academics who tried to justify the caste law here did, which is what they were commissioned by our Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is our national equalities body, to conduct a study as to the viability of the legislation as it then was. Mm-hmm. And they came up with this idea that, well, you know what we should do? We should conceptualize caste in as elastic a way as possible, which is basically an admission that we don't know
Anything
what
goes.
caste is. Yeah, anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So that's the natural consequence of this kind of attitude, which is that you just pick a kind of pet theory you have, and that's basically on personal preference rather than scientific validity.
Right.
And you just go around advocating that, advocating its implementation or application or whatever. And you can imagine all kinds of rubbish that will happen in future in the courts in Britain, right?
Right.
Once that kind of attitude takes root, which it already has in a way.
Right. Which I mean, Racchit, do you have anything to add to what I said? Or
Well, yeah, just I guess a couple of questions and something to add to discussion. I mean, I find all this very interesting. I want to play devil's advocate for a second. So, we're
Sure.
saying that because our discussion kind of is turning a bit Socratic right now in the sense that we're digging into what a word really means, and then we're saying it doesn't mean anything. But let's go back to the social realities. Like ostensibly, this whole current debate about caste, is so that we can address certain social issues that are happening in India, the experience of violence by certain groups, or I mean, at least it's alleged. I know that the data has been analyzed and there's all kinds of interesting results that have come out of it. But going back to that, right? So if we can't define caste, I mean, there's no real definition of caste. But then going back to the ground reality of what people are experiencing, there's something that they're experiencing. There's an inequity over there, and so how do we identify and address that?
Yeah, sure. So let's assume that some violence takes place in a country like India. Right. Certainly. I mean, that nobody would gainsay a statement like that. Now, in India, what we have is very specific legislation which says that a set of listed groups, right? So in India, there's no real effort to even go into the definition of caste and try to conceptualize it and so on. So in Indian legislators have taken the short way out, which is to say, okay, are you a member of this group? If you're a member of this group, then this particular legislation applies to you. Whether it's reservations legislation, so access to quotas for university places, jobs, etc., or it's criminal law legislation, right, which says that if you're a member of one of these groups and you've been affected by a member of a group which is not one of these groups, we may deign to classify what you've experienced as a caste atrocity, right? So there, in fact, what that legislation does is that it creates a list of presumed victims, right? Which in any Western country would be impossible to imagine. Absolutely. Although Western law is moving in that direction anyway, but still, on all kinds of other bases. But let's leave that aside for the moment. Right, so in India, what you have is the caste atrocities legislation of 1989, which was strengthened more recently in 2016, creates this, establishes a list of presumed victims or presumptive victims, where only if you belong to a certain group can you say that a crime has been committed against me, or this specific type of crime has been committed against me. Now, let's leave all that aside. Right? So, because the basic point here is that Indian law circumvents the problem of conceptualizing caste by simply listing groups of people. And those lists, interestingly enough, are based on colonial legislation, in which we need to do more research. Like we need to trace the trajectory of how that came to be. Because as far as I'm aware, there isn't a proper study done on that. The transition between the colonial to the post-colonial. But certainly these groups are already listed under one of the constitutional orders back from 1950. So there's a very close timeline between the colonial period and the post-colonial. Now let's take up the challenge of addressing the claim that certain groups are disproportionately exposed to violence, let's say, or crimes in India. And that exposure is related or even is dependent upon their membership of a particular caste group or a set of caste groups. True or false? My co-editors, who also co-write a chapter in the book, say that if we look at the national crime statistics in India, which spells out actually what members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the number of instances of reported crimes they are exposed to, at least by way of self-reporting, right?
Right.
You'd be able to show the level of exposure of these groups to criminal activity as victims. Astonishingly, I mean, I was certainly astonished when I read their chapter. They find that the official criminal records, statistics in India show that members of this group as a class, because there are multiple, let's say, jatis who are listed as scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, are disproportionately less likely to face crimes.
It's quite interesting.
Less likely than the rest of the population. Right? Now that's astonishing. So what happens, and they go further in the chapter is extremely interesting, because what they say is that, well, that's the hard picture, right? That's the picture the hard picture that you can derive from the statistical figures, which are publicly available. They also say that most academics and activists as well, who work for NGOs and so on in India, tend to rely less on the hard figures and more on supposition and anecdote, right? So they produce, as the British NGOs have done, right? They produce stories about victimization, etc., and then they make sense of those stories by reference to the caste system. So as with what's happening in Britain, where you have the caste system story circulating in the background, not being questioned, you also have the caste system story circulating in India in the background, right? Which is then allocated the work of making sense to the individual anecdotes, right? And that's how academics and NGO actors in India have basically produced a picture of a disproportionate exposure of certain members of certain groups to crime in India. But there's nothing solid behind that. It's just a colonially constructed or Christian stroke colonially constructed conception of the caste system, which is actually doing the work, right?
Absolutely.
Their stories or their data doesn't disprove or prove the existence of the caste system or exposure of certain groups to violence or crimes because of the existence of that.
Right. So I mean,
it's presupposed rather than proved.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just an axiom instead of having like an actual empirical basis.
Exactly.
And me, so my day job is as a data scientist. So, I find this very interesting that there's not a data-driven approach to, sort of finding reasons for this. And you raise a really interesting point in terms of, them relying on anecdotal evidence and sort of presupposing certain victim groups, and by extension, also presupposing certain perpetrators, right? So I've seen some reporting in India, for example. There was one event that happened in Maharashtra many years ago, I remember, and the headline read, "Upper caste, group attacks a Dalit." When I dug into that article, it didn't say much, but I found other articles. I actually found out that the community that attacked the poor Dalit was, in fact, from an OBC community, right? Yes. So what happens by extension is by reporting a certain way, the image that's conjured in someone's mind is a group of Brahmins or Kshatriyas or whoever else going and beating somebody up. Now, again, this is well known that in parts of the country like UP and Bihar, where Brahminical groups have social dominance, that they are indeed part of the perpetrators of the crimes. Although you will find OBC communities and so on also indulging in them. But there's a supposition that this is the case all over the country, while the historical reality is that these groups, the Brahmins, didn't hold that much sociological power, sort of social power all over the country. There were certain pockets, yes, but every region has its own social dynamic that put different people in positions of power. So that I just find very interesting.
I want to jump on that and just bring up another point. And I think like Professor Shah, what you indicated is from what Sufia Pathan and Duncan Jalki,
that's right.
Their stuff.
That's right.
So
that's right.
And I think the interest and the point that really struck out to me is by having this overarching notion of a caste system or even caste violence, what we're doing is kind of putting a bomb on trying to actually do a deep dive into figuring out why communities are loggerheads with each other. We're very comfortable saying, "Oh, it's just caste violence. This is just how communities are. Or this particular caste is to other castes," as opposed to saying, what is the underlying issue that's causing communities to have such friction and resort to violence. Maybe it's a tribal nature of some sort of historical contention between the two groups, just like Racchit said about politics of power between two people that are already maybe economically oppressed or marginalized or some other way, right? Not necessarily based upon some sort of hegemony of quote unquote upper caste putting their boot down on lower caste. This is maybe an issue of something else. And I think what we're losing in having just this boogeyman of caste sitting above everything else is no need to actually do any more like truly investigative journalism or true empirical research and kind of just assigning it all to the boogeyman.
Yes, absolutely. I'd agree with that. So caste becomes one of the meta explanation for social conflict in India. The other one, of course, is religion, right? So, and both of them seem to play this role where, insofar as they act as a kind of not just a meta explanation, but which is regularly presupposed as the explanation for, how Indians act towards each other. And yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that's also perhaps had the effect of displacing efforts to generate a much better understanding of how Indian society actually ticks and how conflict works in India, and why it happens. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. So one of the things that these kind of studies are doing is inspiring us to dig deeper, right? Because they're certainly pointing to the fact that our available explanations are not working, right? They're actually not even worth the paper that they're written on because, they're so full of, unscientific assumptions, basically.
Yeah, it appears to me a lot of this is a house of cards built on a foundation of clouds, right? It's very much like the sense of let's just build theories upon this theory that has, to be honest, no credible, you can't define it, so you don't even know what it is. And on top of it, you're just assuming it exists without having any sense of how it exists. And so it strikes me as a very easy explanation to avoid doing work. I mean,
yes. Well, you see, but there are. So sorry to interrupt. I'll just quickly jump in, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
As my interlocutors today, you seem to have an openness to exploring these ideas, but so we might say, or we might agree among the three of us that yes, certainly these are house of cards. But if you look at the dominant patterns occurring in academia and in the NGO world and in the international, let's say the international United Nations spheres and so on, this is not how they think, right? So despite the existence of these critiques, which have been around for, let's say, a short while, right? Balu's hypothesis about religion, like India not having any religion and certainly not there being, nothing like Hinduism in existence, has been around for decades now. At least 3 decades it's been around, right? Have we fundamentally changed our conception of India, let's say with respect to Hinduism and religion? We haven't. Right, so we might agree among ourselves that this is definitely, these are definitely houses of cards, or one big house of cards.
Yeah.
But what is it that allows the dominant theoretical frameworks to persist? Well, had it been ordinary science, you might say, well, I mean, okay, even ordinary science has to experience paradigm shifts and so on, right? Sure. So it's not as though established scientific theories and their proponents would simply give way.
No.
In the social sciences, and particularly the study of India, which Balu has tried to challenge in a very fundamental way, we've got such a massive amount of work to do still, right? Because somehow there is a kind of stasis. And I don't know if you can simply explain it by the available theories of the philosophers and the historians of science.
No.
Can you do that? I don't know. I mean, it's an open question for all of us.
I tend to, one of the things and this is, I think, and Racchit probably can chime in after me, but one of my feelings and intuitions about this is that there is this sense of, and it kind of connects to what you were talking about earlier, is there's this experience that people have of India, of whatever, of caste, of this and that because it is so difficult to delve into, thousands of years of history or even communal history between groups within a region or area, there is a dissonance for them from this experience to have an explanatory framework that actually can explain it, that when you attack the idea of caste, what happens is you're attacking their experience. And people, when they get attacked for their experience or their conception of whatever that experience is, like, for example, like a Westerner that has no sense of what the workings of India are, but are so sure that caste must exist and this violence must be based on caste because they get it from third parties or they hear it from somebody else, you're attacking their entire framework for their own existence. And once that happens, there's this reactionary I think psychological impulse to rigorously defend it despite all evidence to the contrary. And I think that's kind of what's happening right now. And this is not just in caste, but I think generally in this modern movement towards extreme leftism. And I know the term cultural Marxism is a persona non grata amongst academia in some sense, but I think there's this underlying current there that everything has to be explained in some sort of power dynamic, hierarchy, oppression, because it validates people's narratives about where they are, why they are there, and then it gives you a sense of an out of saying, I didn't do well because of the institution of XYZ, as opposed to saying, well, I'm sure there's some reality to that. The world is way too complex to have a univariate like response or explanation. It's multivariate. And I think in this sense, caste has become that overarching univariate response, caste or religion, to explain India. And to attack that basis, any of these bases, is to fundamentally attack experiences that are both real and perceived.
So let me try to reformulate what I think is important in what you're saying, which is that the trend particularly in social sciences and humanities today, the dominant trend even in the West, and in fact led by the West, is towards greater, not less, but greater skepticism towards the way in which natural scientists would formulate problems.
Yes.
And so we're moving further and further away from scientifically oriented explanations in the so-called social sciences. And that makes our job in terms of understanding or studying a culture like India even more difficult.
Absolutely.
Because we simply don't appear to have the kind of traction which you would expect if we were doing natural sciences.
I think so. I mean, I think you captured it perfectly. Racchit, do you have anything to add to this? Because I think you probably do.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, being someone who's actually has an academic grounding in the natural sciences and social science, having studied humanities, I've found the studies have really informed me where initially I had a view of science just being the absolute most rational way of looking at the world. My studies of the humanities, and especially philosophy of science, made me reassess that and realize the paradigm shift over time. And yes, there is a sense of a lack of finality to this, but in some sense, this is the best we can do. At the same time, this whole movement towards, epistemological anarchism in the humanities, I also find very funny, because it's like, then you're basically getting to a point where anything goes and you can say anything and get away with it. And there's not one agreed upon standard to look at the world around us. And so, it's a very interesting situation.
Yes, but what do you make of our ability to make sense of a culture like India? Then does it get more obscure and in a way worse, or do you see some light at the end of the tunnel?
Okay, and I do see some light, but so let me put it this way. From the Western perspective, what's happening in Western scholarship is, again, we're moving away from this grounding in, sort of a more scientific method to exploration. So we have a diversity of method and world. We used to look at cultures like India, which already is so complex. And so, people can take their own biases and their own agenda and apply it to their research program and scholarship to say what they want. At the same time, what I see happening on the other end of the spectrum in India, on the observed native mind, is that there's been a colonization of mind over the past couple hundred years. I see that a death of sort of an indigenous humanities and a classical studies culture in India. We don't have. I actually went to school over there till 12th grade, so I've seen this firsthand. There's not a culture of critical thinking. There's this whole idea of received wisdom is what we have to rely on, and authority figures. And so it's moved away from religious texts and religious figures to more sort of, current scholars, right? So there's always an argument on, to authority where, hey, such and such, Shashi Tharoor said this, and so it must be true. He's so articulate and he knows what he's talking about. So, we in India, people don't really analyze the ideas that they've received. The one experience I had was this whole idea of, again, the Aryan invasion, where this is such an ingrained idea in people's heads, where we have start having a conversation about this, and again, put the evidence in front of them. Hey, we can't really say anything about this. They're shocked. They're like, well, this is what we read in our history books, and we assume that this is true. Now, in terms of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, I just, I'm fundamentally a person who likes to look at the world from a pluralistic point of view. So that's why I've studied various academic disciplines, and I find that idea, quite joyous. That yes, this world, when we look at it from different sort of lenses, it's the blind man and the elephant parable, that we can come up with different views of the world, each of them saying something about the world, but each of them not authoritative. And so, let's have a diversity of views and get a more holistic picture of looking at the world.
And I think just to touch on what Racchit said here, I think, is it Marianne Keppins that wrote about the Aryan invasion? And yeah. And I think it's really interesting because, to be honest, like, we've had a few podcasts, and over the course of a few podcasts, this idea of Aryan invasion keeps popping up, and I think it's, and people like to throw it into the dustbin and say, oh, it's just a theory, or it's out there, it doesn't really matter to day-to-day lives. Yeah, I think in some sense that's true, but in another sense it's wrong, because, like, as Professor Kippins points out, it actually undergirds the entire framework of how Indians view their own selves in some sense, right? It is a very, very much, like, for example, like the Dravidian movement in the South and Tamil Nadu is entirely based upon this theory. The idea of these Adivasis and this community and that community is all based on this idea that somehow they were indigenous and everyone else, these upper castes, were not, and they were light skinned, and the natives were dark. When you look at the not only the evidence for any of these things, whether it's linguistic, archaeological, or genetics, or whatever, nothing aligns. And the difficulty is none of this stuff aligns, but yet we talk about these things as if they're a fundamental fact of nature.
Yeah, absolutely. The facts about Indian society. Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about Marianne Keppins' chapter is that she shows how the Aryan invasion theory hasn't just been instrumental in this Dravidian Aryan divide story, but also the caste system story. The Aryan invasion theory actually supplied a kind of adjunct to the dominant story of the caste system. And the other interesting thing I suppose to take away from that chapter is how the notion of the Aryan invasion finds expression as a series of stray comments among pre-20th century Orientalists, which somehow get the air or attain, acquire the air of a serious hypothesis about India.
Yeah.
Now, how does that happen? It's actually a bit like the caste system story, right? The strongest account of the accounts of the earliest and strongest account of the caste system and its immorality are actually to be found in Protestant missionary writing.
Yeah.
And yet, these things have now become common sense social science ideas about Indian culture and society. How does that happen? As though, so in the first place, and in fact, even you could argue also for the Aryan invasion theory, right? A theological account becomes a kind of meta-theoretical account about how Indian culture and society functions.
Yeah, and she brings this up with the Purusha Suktam, right? About the idea of, the Brahmanas from the head, Kshatriyas from the shoulders, Vaishyas from the thighs, and the Shudras from the legs. And normally it's been depicted as being like this hierarchical system. And she actually makes a point, and actually most people that have done the tradition and the practice make the point, and not the scholars who have never done yajna or understand how that stuff works, but the human male, the Purusha, is laid on the ground, like flat, right? It's a sense of, even if you assume such a thing as the four Varnas are engraved and fundamentally part of the Vedic system, there's no hierarchy present, at least in that layer, right? Because the Purusha is laid on the ground, and each of them are equal position from the ground. And
this is a very sorry, please continue.
And the second thing is, and a lot of people just bring that one line up in the Purusha, so they don't follow it up with the second line that comes after that, which says, the Surya comes from the eyes, the Chandra comes from the mouth, Indra and Agni, like all the other deities are also connected to the Purusha's body. So are you telling me now Prithvi, who is earth, who is the feet of Purusha, and the Shudra, who is also the feet of the Purusha, they're both like somehow degraded? Where in the text itself, Prithvi or earth is the mother of everything, is so highly lauded. And this is the difficulty, is there's selective reading of the text to buttress an idea to show how a religion is fundamentally hierarchical from the get-go. And I think that is such a terrible way to view our literature, and this is all these views come from very strong Protestants and Christians and missionaries that come from this. Yes. And I think Racchit might have something to add to this too, because I mean, both of us we read a lot of we both know Sanskrit, and we read quite a bit of the ancient texts, and we have our own practices. But yeah, Racchit, go ahead. I know you have something to say.
No, I think you basically said what I was going to say about that connection again with Prithvi coming from the feet, and it's lauded, so highly that, that doesn't make sense. If we're going to apply it to, the social divisions of humanity, why not apply it to these, to divinity? So, I do find that very interesting. And as someone who chants the Purusha Suktam very regularly, having studied a little bit in the commentary on it, I mean, I again find, the pattern that the early scholars, used to study that text and other related Sanskritic texts to be very interesting and fundamentally misinformed. I mean, to me, it's again, they had a clear agenda and they applied their own framework instead of actually looking at, hey, what do the indigenous people who actually use this stuff say about it? What does the commentarial tradition say about this, and how do they, go ahead with their interpretation? So it's very interesting, and I think this conversation has informed that discussion.
Yeah. Well, you see, I mean, there's several things in what you've said. I mean, to some extent, you're on difficult terrain if you want to reference back to what the indigenous purveyors of the tradition say, because you see, they're also the certain amount of care is going to have to be exercised. But going back to the initial point. And the main point, I think, the main thing that one should take away from our conversation is that how the prevailing this meta theoretical specter of the caste system, and in the background, this India's false religion and so on, how that has worked to fundamentally distort the most visible evidence from the tradition, which is the textual tradition, right? And presumably the most evocative aspects of that tradition has been completely distorted as a consequence of the prevailing background frameworks.
Yep.
And I don't think that's not only to do with the Purusha Shukta. I think it's fundamentally affecting the reading of the entire corpus of the Indian traditions, right?
Right.
Whatever literary corpus they've produced, let alone the practices and so on.
Well, even Martin Farrick, right, in his article about Buddhism and Brahmanahood, right, he wrote that one, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
yes.
Where we have the like the idea, like for example, and this goes back to not only just the Hindu text, but also Buddhist and Jain in a very fundamental way, because his article clearly shows, or he lays out the framework that's saying even the Buddhists and Jains at the time of when they came around were not talking about anti-varna. They were just trying to redefine or define what each of the varnas meant within their tradition, because both those traditions are anyway world renouncing traditions. And nowadays we have this sense that Buddhism came out as a reformation, Jainism came out of a reformation against the caste system, and that's actually lauded as if like it's the truth from Buddha himself, when the words of Buddha actually are very different.
Yes, absolutely. So the way in which Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism later on as well have been read as though they're some kind of Protestant or rather some kind of attempted reformation of Hinduism, along the lines that the Protestant Reformation was in Europe, is also based on that template. Yeah, it is the Protestant reading of Indian history, basically,
right,
or the Indian past. And I think the discussion that you mentioned was more about who is a Brahmana, right? Who qualifies to be a Brahmana, or who exemplifies the qualities of a Brahmana. So yeah, absolutely. And all these strands of the Indian traditions worked to, in a way, also to provide some answer to that question, right?
Right.
So they work within the tradition rather than against the fundamental
absolutely.
presuppositions of the traditions. Yeah.
Racchit, I know you might have something to say on this.
No, and yeah, this is very interesting. As Professor Shah said, they do indeed work within the system. In my reading of the Jaina texts, they haven't found anything explicitly anti-caste. Their theology, their mythology talks very much about all the ancient Kshatriya dynasties and even Brahmanas, whether they talk about them, slightly positive or negatively. Again, that's up for discussion. And in my reading of the Buddhist tradition, especially Mahayana tradition, I found very interesting certain quotes, and I can't give you the reference right now, but we could put in the show notes, that there's this whole idea that the bodhisattvas and the Buddhas can only be born in a Dvija family, and also particularly only Kshatriya and Brahmana families. And the whole idea that Maitreya, the future Buddha, will be a Brahmana, and because the previous Buddha was a Kshatriya. So this is kind of a movement towards, just these two groups that are considered very noble. So, this idea definitely pervades Buddhism. I've brought this up multiple times with, people, sort of neo-Buddhists who go with the whole idea of Buddhism being a reformation. And
basically these are anti-caste movements, right? They've been transformed into anti-caste movements.
Exactly.
As has the Chaitanya Vaishnavism. They've all managed to transform themselves into or they have been transformed by their interlocutors and students and so on. So yeah, absolutely.
So we've taken a lot of your time. I just want to end on a few points. I just want to make it clear to our listeners also that one of the things that none of us are saying is that there's no such thing as violence between communities, or that there isn't oppression or there isn't marginalization of people or groups by other groups. I don't think any of us will say that. But I think the gist of what we're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, guys, is that the way we conceive of this violence or marginalization in terms of some sort of system of caste is the problem, and more so than fighting the idea that there is such a violence.
It's a problem in at least two ways. It's a problem in the sense that it's leading you down a false path, and secondly, it's preventing you from formulating better explanations of what's happening in society.
And then I think the last point that I would like to make is also, many times when we refer to Hindu texts, and Racchit brought up like Brahmana Kshatriyas, I mean, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that most of the writers of these texts tend to be Kshatriyas and Brahmanas, or the ones that have survived to this day. And there can be something to be said about that in separate conversation with, people maybe with Professor Minsk, Prakash, Prakash, your mentor might have some ideas about this, but it just, that's separate from that fact is, it could also includes the fact that we don't hear many voices of the Vaishyas and Shudras and other people from the ancient time period, and we also have to be cognizant that is there too.
So Mukunda, I would actually
do we know that? I'm not sure if I'll go with you on that actually.
Okay.
How do we know? Well, first of all,
this is good. I like
that kind of statement would first of all want us to subscribe back into the caste system story, because we think that there are varying levels of oppression within Indian society, presumably, and
right.
Therefore the voice of the most oppressed have been repressed or suppressed, and that they should be able to. Do we know that?
Well, I'm not saying they were
do we know
suppressed
any?
or repressed.
Do we know the truth of any of the components of that
so,
way of framing the issue?
No, so I mean, then let me reframe it. I'm not saying they were repressed or suppressed. I am saying that what we have today is only that, right? There could have been quite a bit of writings that these communities wrote, but we don't have them. And it also could be the case that these communities, and again, I could be totally mistaken, and I'm only talking about it in the sense of what we know. I mean, we know in the Upanishads there are some level of all four varnas involved. But I don't, again, what we know about some of these texts is that what we have today, right? There's so many, I think someone has indicated there's like 30 or 40 million manuscripts of different texts that have yet to be translated and brought to the forefront. So all I'm saying is what we tend to study tend to be from these communities. I know, Racchit, you might have a different perspective.
Yeah, so I'm actually more in line with Professor Shah on this in terms of, can we really, argue in this way? I'd say that there are, certain ideas of, these so-called quote unquote lower classes that exist in the Mahabharata, right? With the whole episode, the Anishramsyam Parodharma, where the fowler is actually responding to the Brahmana, right? And so there's in the story of Nala and Damayanti. I'd also say the medieval texts, actually, when you look at the Nath tradition, when you look at a lot of Tantric and Shakta texts that are not Sanskrit, they're more medieval languages, or even in Sanskrit, that there's completely, you will see a voice of, these, I wouldn't say certain quote unquote caste groups, but heterodox groups who.
Can I throw in a spanner in the works?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Racchit,
Go for it.
Look, let me put the problem in this way.
Right.
If you have somebody who's not qualified to talk about physics, would you want them to talk about physics?
Absolutely not.
So that's the kind of problem it seems to me that you're facing.
Right.
Okay. I can see that. Yeah. I can see that.
Because you see, if it depends how you look at the Indian traditions. If you look at them as knowledge traditions, and that there's a group of people who develop, research, transmit knowledge, teach it, etc., etc. And then at the same time, we're saying that we don't know what the people who haven't taught would want to say.
Right.
Although they haven't engaged in research, etc., etc. It's that kind of problem that I think you're putting. If you adjust the lens to the perspective that I'm speaking from, I'm trying to speak from,
Yeah.
So obviously there are presuppositions there as well, right? Like it's not as if I'm coming without presuppositions, but what is the better way of viewing the problem?
And actually, now that you put it that way, if you look back, and I'm quickly going through my head, just thinking out loud, is yeah, you're right. If you look at it as a knowledge tradition, right, many of our texts tend to be very knowledge centric, focusing on a particular topic or particular practice or whatever. So it makes sense that only people that engage in that practice would talk about it.
Or surely you'd want to know about knowledge from its purveyors, not from its non-purveyors, right?
So yes, and absolutely, no. Put in that context, it makes a lot more sense to talk about it as a system of knowledge, as opposed to talking about it as a system of expression of all people.
Yeah, or class interests or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
Obviously, if we buy that story, the social justice warrior story about Indian traditions, then it's legitimate to talk in the way that you earlier expressed it.
Sure, I can see that.
Yeah. Because then we would want to value all perspectives, and the voiceless, the subalterns should be given their voice, etc., etc. Right. But is that the kind of situation we're facing when we're talking about, I don't know, production of knowledge within the Indian traditions?
No.
So, what is the order of our question, in a sense?
No, and I think how you framed it does change how you approach it.
Yeah.
No, Professor, thank you for bringing this up.
And it's not as though there isn't an argument to be had about that, right? Like how are we viewing it? So that's where I think it's very important that we move the debate there as well and ask questions about how do we view what we're seeing here? What is it? What is it that we're viewing?
No,
because if it's one thing, then a certain type of question is appropriate. If it's the other thing, another type of question may well be appropriate.
You're correct. Racchit, you had something to say.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, Prakash, thank you for bringing that up, because, it just kind of goes to show that how ingrained this way of thinking about the world is in our minds, right? That even without questioning our own assumptions, we start to talk about these things in this way, instead of taking a step back, like you said, and said, hey, is this the right way to look at it? Would we indeed want people who aren't the purveyors of those knowledge systems to be talking about it? And yeah, it just really, makes one pause and start thinking about, deeper assumptions.
True.
So before we end, Professor Shah, do you have? I'll rather end with you at the last word. Racchit, do you have anything to end with?
No, thank you.
Professor Shah, do you have anything you want to tell us? I think not only this, but also like working on the future.
I'll just end with this simple thing, which is that many complaints have been made to me about the price of the book that we're discussing. But one thing which is on the horizon is an Indian edition, a South Asian edition, which the publishers are going to produce probably within the next few weeks. So I would ask or urge your listeners to look out for that. Okay. And it promises to be a much more affordable one than the European edition has been, which is actually basically quite unaffordable for most people in India.
Yeah, it was really expensive, but to be honest, it's a great book to have for anyone that's remotely even interested in these issues. If you can't get into the West, at the Indian price, I would recommend, if you have the ability to buy it, just buy it and share it with your friends or whatever it is you can, because it is a very well researched and very well argued book that really makes you think about how we think about caste.
Yeah, thank you for bigging up the book. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
That's crucial.
And do you have any other work that you're working on that you expect to come out anytime soon, or any last thoughts?
Well, I'm hoping, perhaps against hope, that the stuff that I've been working on with respect to caste, because there's been quite a few smaller projects which have come out as a result of my encounter with caste and caste system studies. They may end up looking like a book-length work, but I'm not making any promises in that direction yet. But that's what I'm hoping to achieve. Let's say, yeah.
Excellent.
At the moment, yeah.
Any last thoughts then? Anything you want to maybe sum up or?
So yeah, I just hope that as a result of our conversation and reading the book and so on, that people begin to take this this kind of hypotheses that are being offered in the book more seriously, and try to develop them, take them further, because I don't think that the book is by any means the last word on it. And I think we admit that. We actually explicitly say that these are very preliminary types of
Right.
hypotheses that we provide in the book, but there's so much more work to be done. And what we've, I suppose, more been able to do is try to inform people about the kind of frameworks that have been influencing our study of caste and of India, right? But it
Right.
doesn't, you see, there's the other side of it, which is that, well, if Indian society is not like this, then what is it like?
Yeah.
Right? So we need to go into that question very, very seriously, but we've got to remove some of the blockages along the way. So I suppose that's what we've been trying to do, is at least provide some means by which people can start to shed the blockages and then move forward.
Yeah.
And the question of how to move forward is by no means obvious, so we need to work on that as well.
Absolutely. So, Professor Shah, thank you so much for your time and indulging us in this long conversation. Which
Thank you for inviting me.
Incredibly interesting, fun, and enlightening. Racchit, anything else?
No, thank you, Professor Shah. Again, yeah, no, this conversation certainly helped, us try to address some of these blockages at a personal level too. So I hope the listeners will also, go read the book and really start talking about these whole topics, with a little more critical thought put in. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Thank you.
Oh, okay.